The one.
Hit record.
Yeah, you got it.
There we go. Now I'm going to share. All right. And I lost. There it is. All right. How's that? Perfect. Well, good morning. I'm Myron Dueck, and I'm coming to you from British Columbia, Canada. It's, well, I guess just after 6 o'clock in the morning, so the light is just coming up the valley. A little dark here in my office. Nice wood paneling, and you can see a couple other things around. It's a pleasure, first of all, to be working with the BOCES group again. I've worked in New York a number of times, and with Fred, and now with Greg and other folks. Probably before I get any further, I wanted to give a shout out to the healthcare workers out there. This is an incredible challenge, to say the least, and I marvel at the professionalism that's being exhibited now by these people. And I think it's something to remember when we head back to our schools, and from ambulance drivers to nurses. So many of these people are parents of our students. I'm certainly going to remind myself to be mindful of how much work those folks are doing right now. So anyway, I want to talk today about getting strategic around standards. I have two kids that I want to talk about just briefly. It's my daughter Sloan. She's the one wearing the hat. Recently did a musical, Matilda, and my son is one who I coach. You see me there in the black and white jacket with the cap on, and he's the delighted number one with a little line under his number. We just lost this match, and Elijah's a bit like his dad, pretty competitive. And anyway, this is what I've been up to recently. So I'm in the schools in my own district. Recently completed a stint of being vice principal of Summerland Secondary School. And more recently, I've been working in District 67 as a district vice principal on assessment and innovation. And you know, it's been a challenge. We're continuing to work on this thing called assessment. And I just want to go there for a moment. We're going to spend a little time on Latin here this morning. The Latin root for assessment is assedere, and it means to sit beside. And I want to, I guess, have this as a bit of our lens this morning, that assessment, or to assess a student, means to sit beside them. And I think for far too long in our education circles, I don't know if people are going to agree or not. By the way, all I can see are some people's faces and my slides. I can't see any chat rooms or anything like that. So I'm going to rely on Greg or anybody else to butt in or whatever.
But I guess I'm going to butt in for just a second before you get too far. If you hit the participants button and it opens up that window, just keep an eye on the waiting room, because if people try to join us late, you're just going to have to click admit next to their name.
So I'm going to have to do that?
If you're hosting, yeah.
Okay, so Greg, the only thing I see, well, I can go manage participants. Yep. Oh, admit. Yep. Now I have to stop every once. I probably have to stop every once in a while. Are you guys seeing my screen then when I admit them? Okay. So
and Myron, just so you know, it'll pop up on the bottom. You'll get a little orange indicator that will say people in the chat room too. So don't worry too much about it, but you should see a little pop up, and then it'll prompt you to admit them.
Okay. All right.
Trying to make your life, Zoom is trying to make your life a little bit easier, hopefully.
Yeah, it's what I'm feeling right now. I'm admitting more people. All right. So why is there a fishing boat on the screen? Well, recently I took up trying to fly fish, and wow, is it frustrating. And at the same time, wrote an article on it for ASCD. So I'm gonna invite people, if you're incredibly bored these days and got nothing else to read, check out the March 2020 issue of EL Magazine, Education Leadership. And you know what? A lot of what I'm going to talk about this morning is kind of linked to what I did in this article, and that is, looking at fishing for the right assessment language, and I'm going to talk a bit about that today, is the kind of language we speak in this realm of assessment. So I guess I think we're still reeling or feeling the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and the essential elements of that were compartmentalization, that we're going to compartmentalize what we do. We're going to have these neat little boxes, and where we put things is going to be so efficient that I guess I want to ask everybody a question out there. Do you think we've compartmentalized our competencies? And what I mean by that is, hey, if you're looking for problem solving, head down the hallway there to math and science. And if you're, I got some people coming in. If you're looking for critical thinking, history and psychology are down that hallway. And you know, if you're looking to communicate, we have an English program, and oh, creativity in this school. Yeah, we're running a theater program. So I guess my first question for people out there is, do you think this is a reality in your school? Do you think that we place these things around our buildings? Because I'm going to tell you right now that I think, and I'm going to try to admit, I think in my school district anyway, this is one of the things that we've done. And I wonder if there's anybody out there, chat room or wants to speak. Someone raised their hand. Greg, what do we do? What do we do?
So Dana's got her hand raised. You want to go ahead, Dana?
Yeah. I don't know if I see it maybe as a school-wide issue. It might be department or within teachers. I think there are some teachers that can mix and match it. And I think there's also colleagues in the field who are more collaborative in nature, work with teachers from other departments. And I find that students really, in most cases, really resonate because they don't think about tapping into that unless we make it more explicit. So I think one way to fight that issue is, you know, how do we really promote that professionalism? How can we collaborate across the disciplines? So interdisciplinary learning might be one way to fight that. Not that that was your question, but that's how I see it as a solution.
No, I completely agree. And I think thankfully, Dana, you asked this question a few years ago. I think it was very much compartmentalized. I think we're taking steps to do things that are cross-disciplinary. I think we are taking steps to focus on these greater skills right across the curriculum. But I certainly talk to teachers out there who say, no, I think we're still feeling the ripples of this. And for me anyway, working in schools, I often put my ear to the ground and I can still hear this language. Like I hear people say, that the feeling that it's not my responsibility, that particular skill development is somebody else's. And hopefully maybe I'm alone in that, and that it's changing dramatically. So I guess what I want to go over to for a moment is Dylan Willem's contention that you take something like critical thinking. It's not a skill we would say, okay, today at 9 a.m. guys, we're going to start to critically think. But rather that this is a collection of skills. And where I'm going with that is an interesting little statistic. And Dana, I think this speaks to your argument or whatever, that we should look at cross-disciplinary, because it turns out as human beings, we don't transfer skills really well from one context to another. We ourselves compartmentalize, and I'll make a point with some statistics that's some research that's out there. Did you guys know that things learned underwater are better recalled underwater? Now, I don't think when we head back to our schools, we should all don scuba gear, but this is a really interesting research piece that people who say learn to add fractions 30 feet below the surface with all this gear on will better recall that fractions work when they don scuba gear and go underwater again. Where am I going with this? Well, these studies, putting them together, such as things learned in a certain room are better recalled in that room. We may have students that say, no, I want to take the test right there where I learned it. There's some research to suggest that the way we learn, or the location and context in which we learn a skill, is the place we will most exhibit that skill. Okay? Now I got one more for you, and maybe this is offside, I hope not, but back in the 80s, they were allowed to do these studies. Did you know that things learned after consuming 3 drinks are better recalled after drinking 3 drinks? And yes, they were actually allowed to do these studies at one point. They, when people were in a frame of mind after 3 gin and tonics, and then they studied the map of their university, they better recalled the map of that university with 3 gin and tonics. So the point is this, okay, and I'm going to let Dylan Willem speak for it. There is certainly evidence that getting students to work cooperatively in one setting does spread their ability to cooperate other places. And that's great news. However, for communication, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, the idea that we learn these in one context and are able to apply them all over the place is, here it is, it's attractive, but it's essentially wrong. And I didn't like reading this. I was like, seriously, I was hoping it wasn't this way. And I think where the research is coming, the other side of this is this, that if you want students to think critically in your science class, then you have to be very purposeful around linking that as part of their science instruction. If you, for example, want students to be creative in science, then that too needs to be a part of that instruction. And where I'm going this morning is how exactly do we get really purposeful around this, especially with our standards. But I wanted to kind of set the table first that these things don't transfer on their own. I hope that makes sense. Dana, is that your hand up? There's a little hand there. And then you'd have to unmute if we're going to hear you.
Yeah, I think Dana had her hand up from before. It just hadn't gone down yet.
You could just leave your hand up, then you could talk all the time. Okay. All right. So then you'll if your schools are anything like mine, you'll walk around and you'll hear, oh, we got to teach 21st century skills. And every once in a while, I remind people that we're in 2020. So we're a fifth the way through. So we should probably stop talking about, I think we should bring in 21st century skills. We're in it. All right. So jokes aside, I think we can focus on 21st century skills in our standards as a way to ensure that students are getting that deeper learning experience. And that's kind of where I want to go today. So our standards, and I've looked around in New York standards, British Columbia standards, Switzerland standards, they are indeed changing. And I think that we're seeing examples from all over the world right now of people saying it's time to look at this thing called education a little deeper. So I hope the sound comes through on this. People are going to have to give me a thumbs up. If you can't hear it, we're going to have to skip it. But this is Jack Ma, and he's been a rather successful business person, and they invited Mr. Ma from China to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I grabbed 2 minutes of his clip that I thought might challenge our thinking this morning a little bit. I hope that people can hear this. I want Jack to speak, and I'm going to have some of the words that he's saying are going to populate on the screen. Hopefully people can hear this. Give me a thumbs up if it's all good.
And by the way, education, it's a big challenge now. if we do not change the way we teach, 30 years later we'll be in trouble. Because the way we teach, the thing we teach our kids are the things past 200 years is knowledge-based. And we cannot teach our kids to compete with machine who is smarter. We have to teach something unique. That is, machine can never catch up with us. In this way, 30 years later, our kids have the chance. I hope I answered your question.
It's a very difficult one to answer, but what are those skills that you think we need to teach? If we're moving away from knowledge, what are the key things?
Value, believing, independent thinking, teamwork, care for others. These are the soft part. The knowledge may not teach you that. Folks, that's why I think we should teach our kids on sports, entertainment, the music, painting, art. So making sure humans should be different from everything we teach should be different from machine. If the machine can do better, you have to think about it.
So there it is. Now, if this is my social studies class, we might do a little activity called agree, disagree thoughts. So I kind of wanted to do that this morning. I know you don't have an awful lot of time to let this sink in, but here it is on the screen. What do people think? Do you agree with Mr. Ma? Do you disagree with him? Does it take your thinking in a particular direction? Thoughts?
Maria, go ahead.
So it makes me think about Charles Fadell, the one that wrote the book 21st Skills of the 21st Century. And he just came up with a book called Artificial Intelligence in Education. And he presents similar ideas here. If the machine can do it already, why do we have to compete with the machine? So this idea is all over the place with many other educators and researchers that talk about 21st century skills.
I have something to share.
Yeah,
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Lori.
So I absolutely agree with this. And I see this in my oldest daughter, who is currently a freshman at Lemoyne, although she's home. The work that they're doing, and when they're asked to research or they're asked to respond, it's not what we're doing in schools. They're asked to ponder questions and thoughts, and they don't want the verbatim typical essays that we ask students, formatted essays that we ask students to give. They want their opinion. They want them to back their opinion. They want them to think outside the box. And when I was a high school administrator, one of my teachers said, oh my God, the textbook's online and the kids are finding the answers because all they have to do is type it in. And I'm like, yeah, and it makes me think of this. The machine works smarter, right, than the person. And so if they want information, we have it right here. So
Yeah.
How do we get them to then think on their own without this, or with this as a tool to bring them to a greater understanding or thinking outside the box? So I absolutely agree with Mr. Ma.
Yeah, well, Lori, it's interesting, hey, because I think I swear I felt myself doing this in high school too. When the phone started coming in, suddenly I wasn't the master of that knowledge in my classroom, right? It's like, no, stop. Like, put that away. We're going to be covering that in the next 10 minutes. And I think it really went that way. And I think that we're not, there's probably a natural human inclination to be a little sensitive to that.
Right.
But I'm with you. It seems to be changing. If you're interested in this, I encourage people to read the book, if you haven't, Peak by Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole, I believe. And they talk a lot about University of British Columbia at the very end of the book, moving every one of their introductory physics classes for freshmen, Lori, to electronic responders and group debate. Because the statistics from the study they did on whether they're effective or not was just absolutely overwhelming. How much better students did when they were debating in a group. What do you think the answer to this problem is that the prof put up there? They in fact do 2.5 times better than their fellow students who are simply in a lecture type format. So
Awesome.
if you're, check it out. It's a study led by Carl Weinman, actually, and Carl Weinman was the 2011 Nobel Physics Prize winner. So he knows a thing or two about physics, and he still thought they should teach it in a different way.
And it's called Peak.
Yeah, I might have it here if my desk wasn't in such a disarray. Peak, yeah. In some versions, it's a blue cover with a person standing on the end of a diving board. And in other places, the book, I think the cover is like red and has no diving board on it whatsoever. So I haven't understood that one.
Yeah, I'm looking it up, so I have it.
Okay, perfect. So, one of the things that I guess, Lori, and I want, Lori, I'd love you to stay tuned in here with your microphone on, because you just held up your phone, and I kind of think similarly. Like, there's a pendulum, I think, that has been swinging a little bit, and try this argument on, and you obviously do not have to agree, but this, don't look at knowledge kind of pendulum, and Jack Ma said it right here. Let's play one more clip of his.
The things past 200 years is knowledge based, and
there, that wrist flick. So when he went knowledge based, I'm going to do this to you, Lori. I'm going to give you a wrist flick. It doesn't feel very good, does it? I mean, you can try going up to someone. These days, it'll have to probably be in your own home with social distancing, but
Right.
right. So I was I was watching this video of this Davos, Switzerland clip, and I was like, yeah, I don't know though, Jack. You kind of lost me there. I don't know about that. So what I think is that, I mean, I have said this so many times. I mean, knowledge is dead. I've got a phone, just look it up there. And recently on Twitter, and I should have probably been nicer. I don't think I was very nice to this person. Somebody tweeted, you should never teach what someone can Google. I was like, these kind of comments on Twitter are so easy to make. And I don't know if I agree. So Lori, what are your thoughts? Is knowledge dead?
I think knowledge in terms of, it's how we define it. We can be knowledgeable in that we learn from experiences, right? So how do we define knowledge? Is knowledge book knowledge? I can have street smarts, and that makes me knowledgeable in situational things, but I think our experiences is, my definition of knowledge is the experiences that I have in particular settings or circumstances. So I don't think it is all book smart. I don't think it's anything, it's not all out of books. It's not all out of what you could Google.
Right.
But rather the experiences that we have that bring us to this greater knowledge. So if I'm working, we're working collaboratively, the knowledge that we're gaining, we would never be able to look up on Google.
No.
However, we still are using knowledge base. So we're utilizing research. We're looking at, Mr. Moss' work. We're looking at Peak. So we're taking all these experiences and then making them into our own understanding, and then sharing that knowledge, if you will.
Right. And I guess on this note, Greg, is that your hand up? Greg, come on in.
Yeah, so we've been struggling with this concept a lot in the curriculum and instruction department as we try to support teachers and districts around standards changes. And I think you're right. Like, one of the things, it can't be all or nothing in that pendulum swing. We talk a lot about content instead of knowledge, but I think it's kind of synonymous for our conversation now. And I like to think of the content as, like, if you're an artist, either the paint or like the clay that like a potter might have, right? It's what you manipulate and what you use those other skills that we were talking about, those ways of thinking, the problem solving, the creating something new, a new understanding or new knowledge out of something that existed. You have to do that with a medium. You have to practice it with something. So like really good clay doesn't make you a good potter, but really bad clay makes a really good potter look bad. So we try to think of it, or at least that's kind of the ways we're starting to play around with these ideas a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's, and there's people that are, there are people chiming in on the chat, and I'm trying to keep up on that a little bit. So hopefully there's maybe somebody who can help me with that, because there's a few moving pieces here. But I love to see the chat is populating. Greg, maybe if you see something come across that chat and you want to bring it in, it'll be one less thing for me to juggle on this end. And so, I mean, I think Lori, Greg, I think it's a really, really good segue into this next piece, because I think if I think back to my grade 9 social studies class, my grade 9 and 10 leadership class, history 12, whatever, I don't know that you can take knowledge and put it in a jar and close it and say, here it is, or I'm going to look it up on my phone. And this is where I was super grateful to bump into the work of Lauren Anderson. So Lauren Anderson and David Krathall were both students of Benjamin Bloom way back in the 1970s, I believe. And what they did is they've come up with kind of this framework, which I want to use today, just a little tool that I can pass on to people. I didn't make it. But the first thing they did is they said, well, knowledge is multidimensional. Like, you've got facts when it comes to knowledge. So I'm going to give you an example. And all of these are going to start with, I know. So I know that the 2018 World Cup of Soccer was held in Russia. All right, it's a fact, right? It's knowledge. But there's concepts as well. So I know the structure of the World Cup zones and other soccer systems like Champions League or Premier. Now, when I've got soccer friends of mine start talking about the structure of those leagues and kind of I got no idea what they're talking about. I might know the 2018 World Cup was held in Russia, but you've just taken a whole nother step into that concept. Not to mention procedural knowledge that, oh, I know how my team would make it to the World Cup, the route they would take through all the qualification rounds. It's like, whoa, yeah, I know those are complicated also. And then maybe where that book peak is going, the metacognitive. I know how I best learn and how I might best learn the complex structures of professional soccer. So my point this morning is that all of these start with I know. So these are all levels of knowledge that I think we have to be aware of in our classroom, schools, and everyday lives. Now, I'm going to ask people to do me a favor. We're just going to put this aside for a second, recognizing that this goes from the simple to the complex. From yes, I could look it up on my phone, to really complex as far as people understanding how they learn. So are people okay? Give me a head nod. Are people okay with this, at least as a idea or a construct of knowledge? Okay. So here's a question, right? If you go to your classroom and people are going, knowledge is dead, and somebody walks in and says this: in Brazil's recent election of a more right-leaning government and a reduction in environmental protection of the Amazon basin, increased deforestation in rainforest ecosystems may diminish the planet's capacity for photosynthesis. All right. So how complex is that statement? Does that make sense to people? Lori, does that make sense to you? No? Okay. So now my question for you is, how many separate chunks, and Anderson talks about chunks, the research going way back to George Miller at Carnegie Mellon and Princeton speaks about chunking. How many chunks of knowledge pieces are there in this statement? So let me give you an example for the question, okay? There is a political chunk. It sits right there, right? So election, right-leaning government, reduction, there's a political chunk. So where's the next one?
You got the reduction of the environmental protection of the basin.
All right. So thanks, Dawn. So we've got an environmental protection, Amazon basin. I'm going to choose to throw deforestation and rainforest ecosystems in there. Next thing you know, we have an environmental chunk. And lastly, you take photosynthesis, we have a scientific chunk. So there's research to suggest that when students bump into missing a knowledge piece, and I'm a big fan of Celeste Kidd's work around this and some of the what allows students to tune in or tune out. Well, if you don't understand one of these chunks that's embedded in a conversation, we as human beings tend to have the natural inclination to just check out, because it often sounds like you lost me in that. It's one of the things that, throwing names out there, Mana Kapoor has found with his work around productive failure. Direct instruction, one of the reasons it often doesn't work super well is that if someone doesn't understand one of these pieces, then they stop making sense of it and they tune out. So anyway, we could spend a long time on this. But the point is that we have knowledge embedded in things like a critical thinking piece or a conversation or whatever. Knowledge is there. So what I want to, I guess, argue this morning is that for the longest time, our education system was focused a lot on the nouns. It's what you have. So I have creativity is the best example Warren Anderson said to me. If we shift our thinking to the verbs, it becomes I can create. So this noun to verb shift, I think, is pivotal in our understanding of what we could do with our learning standards. And this is kind of check my time. This is kind of my giant leap this morning, if you will. So come with me on it if you don't mind, and then we can agree, disagree, whatever. Simon Sinek, in his book, Start With Why. Now, once in a while, I want to prove that I actually have the book on my bookshelf, so it was right back there. Start With Why. I like what Simon Sinek says. Like, we often remind ourselves of our values by them being nouns. I have integrity, I have honesty, I have innovation. But he goes on to argue that they're not actionable. These are all things, and it's really hard to develop systems or incentives around things. It's also impossible to hold students, people, whoever, accountable to nouns. I'd like to see some more innovation today, please, Bob, if you don't mind. And if you have to write honesty on your wall to remind yourself to be honest, you have bigger issues anyway. So here's where Sinek really gets me with his argument. And I'll paraphrase, you can certainly read it. If verbs give us a clear idea how to act in any situation, they give us that rudder. It's not integrity, it's, hey, can you do the right thing? So with this focus on verbs, and the teachers I work with in my own district and the work I've done elsewhere is, I think the verbs in our standards are going to give us a much clearer idea of what our learning objective actually is. And I think this is where Jack Ma is kind of going as well. So back to good old Benjamin Bloom. Let's talk help me out. Brain freeze. Taxonomy. There it is. Sorry, it's on the screen. Lauren Anderson and David Krathall did a little shift to Benjamin Bloom's work. And instead of focusing on nouns as the kind of hierarchy or taxonomy of learning, they shifted it to verbs. And I'm gonna be real honest with people, in right beside, like on my desk, sits this Bloom's revised taxonomy, because I find it so incredibly helpful that if I'm looking at a learning standard and it starts with analyze, I shift over and get a quick little reminder of what analyze is. The student can distinguish between parts of, oh yeah, overall structure and purpose. And then if I want to create an activity, or I want to design a test question, or I want to whatever, I've got a number of verbs there. I just noticed one of them is spelled incorrectly. Compare, contrast, criticize, differentiate. This has been really, really helpful. And I want to demonstrate this morning a few different things we can do with this. So I also want to suggest, and anybody put their hand up, agree, disagree, please chime in. It's not that any one of these, I'm trying to remind myself, it's not that any one of them is better than the other. They serve different purposes. Sometimes it's very, very important to remember. Other times it's really, really good to create. I think we want to get away from that it's a hierarchy as much as it is that each of these has a special place or plays a role in learning. So here's where I think it's going to get a little busier. So we have two things on the table, okay? So please buckle up here for this one, because this is coming up is going to be a slide even busier than this one. We've got the knowledge we discussed, got 4 different kind of things in knowledge, and then we have these 6 dimensions, these cognitive domains, where you may remember, you may understand, you may apply. So a tool that I have found very useful is this one. This was developed by Lisa O'Reilly. You can see that the citation is on the bottom. This has been a very, very useful document for us in our district. A number of teachers who've used it, and recently I was visiting American School of Belo Horizonte, Brazil. We did a session where teachers really dove into what they were doing in their classroom, kind of based around this structure. So one thing you can do with this is you can ask people to audit an assessment. And here's a really, really simple way to do it. I took one of my favorite ever tests, and I thought this was a great end of unit test on an important part of our course. So what I did was this: I put the table beside me, and I went to the first question of my test. Define Italia irredenta. Define. So I'd go over to this table. Where do I find define? Oh, it's under remember. The verbs are define. And then I go down and I hit the knowledge dimension. So what I would do in a case like that is I could put a little mark there. Then I go to question 2 of my test and I do the same thing. And as I go through my test, for example, I start to see patterns emerge. And when I did this with a group of teachers in my own district for professional development, it wasn't long till a teacher threw her pen across the room and said, I'm done with this audit. That's it. And I was like, what? She goes, well, look at where all the check marks are. And they were here, right? They were in this domain, or this area of the chart. Remember and understand factual knowledge. And she said, but this isn't what we do in my classroom. This isn't it. And I said, isn't it nice to find out? Do you think it was any different for my test? No, not at all. It was focused around these things. So I'm curious, what do you think, where does this take people's thinking? Or what do you think would happen if you did this? Or the other question I would ask is, why? Why why was my test, her test, why do we gravitate towards this area of the chart, if you will? Maria, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think I'm going to deviate this a little bit because we have been working with Ron Richard's, following Richard's work on Harvard Project Zero.
Yep.
And in his book, Making Thinking Visible, he states that understanding is a consequence of thinking and is not a type of thinking, which, as Bloom's taxonomy classifies thinking. And then he takes basically the understanding out of the pyramid, because the remembering, the applying, the creating, all these things that we have kids do is to process information, to think about that information, tinker with the knowledge, so they can eventually understand and transfer. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't see this as all that different from that. I haven't read the book that you're mentioning. I believe I have it. It's been on my list. I think this is about people using both knowledge and cognitive processes with that. And I think it's what Greg was referring to earlier. I think when he said, like the artist, what are we going to do with the medium? And this is where it takes my thinking. And I think, Maria, there are so many different constructs that I think we could use that would get us some of the same directions in this conversation. I know that sounds like a pat answer. It's like I'm trying to be a politician and agree with everybody. But when you're saying it, Maria, I'm still hearing at least what I'm getting out of this. So hold on to that thought, because I want to show you, this is one thing we do with it. It's audit your assessment. And teachers that I've worked with have done that. And for the longest time, I found that people were happiest when they said, look, I'm all over the place. I have a nice variety. And the more I think about this process, and I'm going to leave metacognitive out for a moment, I don't actually think it's about variety. It's not about how many X's can I have or notches in how many boxes. I don't think that's it. What I think it is if we look at our standards, and I'm going to go to New York State, because I think that's where many of you are tuning in from. And I'm teaching grade 11 and 12 ELA, and I find this one, analyze a case in which grasping point of view requires distinguishing one's recognition. All right. I think we can get a little more strategic around a standard using a document like this. So for example, analyze. All right, let's start with the verb, analyze. And I'm going to go over and I'm going to select that box. Analyze, breaking something down into components. So analyze what? What are we analyzing? A case in which grasping point of view or perspective. Perspective. So where would you put perspective in the knowledge sections? Would it be factual, conceptual, procedural, metacognitive? Perspective. Yeah, of course it's a term, but you want someone to grasp point of view. Fact, concept, procedure. Now that you've had some time to think about it, don't see a lot of hands up. I'm going to argue that it's conceptual. At least on some levels, for me, it's a concept of point of view. So now, the very first part of the standard that I'm looking at has an intersection. It has an intersection at the streets of analyze and concept. And at least I'm going to now try to hone in on that area. And maybe there's going to be activities or instructional materials or procedures that I could even note right on this very document if I chose to. So here's how we're going to tackle this, and this is my plan for getting to that. And then if we go to the next verb, distinguishing, well, actually find it in two different places. To distinguish and distinguishes what's directly stated in a text from what's really meant. I need my students to distinguish what's directly stated in a text from what's really meant. Seems to me to be almost a procedure you'd follow. The use of satire, the recognition of sarcasm. So next thing you know, I've got this. And we've kind of gone in this direction a little more with a tool like this, because I can now see this New York ELA learning standard, Common Core learning standard, in a different light, in a way that allows me to focus my activities and focus my instruction and focus my assessment on these areas, and it makes me look at the standard a little bit differently. I don't know if it does that for other people also. And it's possible, before we go any further, when it comes to satire, sarcasm, irony, understatement, any of those things, we may have to, Maria, I'm going to go back to understand here. We're going to probably have to understand what these terms mean and maybe start with some of those things. I don't know. But this might be what I first look at when my students and I are going to be entering this area of learning standard. So I don't know whether people agree, disagree, but I know that many of the groups I've worked with, teachers have found this very helpful to understand the direction they're going to go with a learning standard rather than just seeing it in its just linear form as a line. So I want to just bring this around to an example, and I know that I'm mindful of my time. Checking it. And we may go just a little bit over because if that's okay with people, we started a little late. So here's an argument I'm going to throw on the table. In a world of competencies, varying degrees of quality for more complex representation of learning is needed. So I think this is, where Jack Ma was kind of going in his argument. And I don't know, I'm going to look for head nodding if it's there, but I think some more complex examples of learning, it's harder to assess these things, is harder than grading traditional content. And I think that when I go pick up my test over there that I threw on the floor, I think one of the reasons I gravitate towards that area of the chart is that it's easier, right? It's easier to assess, define. It's easier to assess, explain, than it is to assess, analyze, evaluate, or create. That's I think one of the reasons I gravitate to that part. And at the same time, I'm trying very hard in my own province and district to explain to parents why we might be moving away from percentage-based grading systems. And I think that one way of looking at this shift is in the verbs. When I have parents come up to me and say, you know, when I was in school, we used percentages. I don't understand why we would move towards these rubrics with just words or whatever. And I say, well, can you explain to me what your schooling experience was like? Well, yeah, we had to, I remember memorizing the 50 states and we had to recite a poem by memory. I said, yeah, these are verbs that are relatively easy to grade by percentage. I think that we're seeing shifts in assessment with our standards to descriptors because our verbs are different. They are verbs like you see over on the right here: evaluate, justify, design, generate. So I think this combination of forces, you got verbs right across the triangle, and we now have to find ways of assessing those things. So what I want to do is give you one example of how we're doing that in our own district. And then I want to stop and take questions and thoughts or whatever with a little bit of time we have. And I'm sorry, I'm going to focus on a grade 12 example. And there's probably people from all kinds of grade levels tuning in. Teachers may come up to me and say, well, look at my verbs, right? We got evaluate, justify, identify, communicate. And some of these are relatively difficult, like assess different interpretations of geographic evidence, for example. So I want to share with you an activity. This is, I think, a great example of a teacher doing something differently because they're in a different era. So the second day of Russ Reed's Geography 12 exam involved his students going on something called a walkabout. And what they would do is they would take their own phone or a Chromebook supplied to them. And what they did for the second day of the exam is they said, Russ walked in and said, okay, guys, we're going to be going on a 45-minute walk. And sometime along this walk, you're going to take 2 different photos. Because when we get back to class, I want you to take a photo you've taken on our walk uptown. We're going to walk 3 blocks up Ellis. We're going to go over to Government. We're going to come back to the front doors of the school and come back to our classroom. Somewhere along the way, you're going to take 2 photos, and each of those photos is going to link to one of the themes we took in our class this year. And students will be like, well, what photo am I taking? He goes, I don't know. You're going to have to make that decision on our walk. So he took this picture and he said, it's just, when we got back, Myron, it was just silent, and I could hear the tapping of students making an argument. And he said the results were fantastic. So you had things like, and I'm just going to click over on the chat for a moment.
So cute.
I'm hoping that, well, maybe I'll have to look at this a little later. Like I said, it's hard to juggle both. So check this out. The student takes one of the quotes, "We do not inherit the land and the sea from our forefathers, we borrow it from our children." She takes a photo of a local mural on the back of a building, and then she goes on to support her choice of, why am I taking that photo from my community, linking it with this quote, and then making an argument. And these are included. Greg, I forgot to mention the handouts. They'll be supplied to people, correct? And I want people to know that these examples are included in your handouts today. But
yeah, Myron, I dropped it before in the chat. I'm going to drop the link to the Google folder in the chat again.
Yeah, and just so you guys know, you're gonna get that chart. You're gonna get a whole bunch of the documents that I've shared, including these. And this one here, for example, was one of the most amazing ones for me. This is a student who was walking along, took a photo of the McDonald's cup laying in the gravel, and went on to talk about, and you can see about the middle of her paragraph, fast food is all around gross. We idle in a car pumping fossil fuels in the atmosphere as we await for a beef burger made only with the utmost bearable hormones, with extremely high levels of water usage, while talking to someone making minimum wage in a province run by the government, working for those at the top. I mean, this is certainly an engaged student, in my opinion, with making a profound argument. So this is, I have a number of examples. Some students just went very symbolic, and I think this is a great example of a teacher, Russ Reed at Penticton Secondary School, just going outside the box to say, there'd be my alarm. Going outside the box to say, how do I tackle a standard that reads, assess geographic evidence? And I think you're seeing examples here of students assessing geographic evidence in their own community with answers that are not clearly defined. I run a session through my work with other districts and schools called Creativity and Assessment, and all we do is look for the elements or the variables in different assessment examples. And one of my favorites here that people identify is that there's no set answer. There's no predefined way that you should think about this. In fact, the materials are not even predefined. You're going to choose what photo it is. So the last shoe to fall, so to speak, everybody, is this. Yeah, we had to go on and create a assessment tool that was different. You're going to see here that Russ and I sat down together and we defined the 3 criteria that students needed to do. And then in his grade 12 class, where he's been mostly familiar with a percentage-based system, we built descriptors of learning. And I'm a big fan of Susan Burkhart's work, where she describes, rubrics. Sorry, she reminds us that rubrics do not judge student work, they describe it. And in this way, Russ is able to come back and use something like this to describe student work, and does it in one of 4 categories. Big shift for Russ, but he says, this is the way to go in looking at this kind of learning. So this has been, we're going to go a few more minutes for questions, and I have a couple other directions if people want to go there, but this has essentially been what I wanted to cover today and investigate, is how do we get strategic around standards that have what some have termed, and I would tend to agree, maybe higher order verbs, or at least more complicated ones. And this has been our attempt to tackle that and work on it. So questions, thoughts? I'm curious what people might think.
So can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is Julie, and I must admit I am still sitting in my pajamas. I haven't adopted the routines
Nice.
that I'm supposed to for my learning, so that's why you're not seeing me.
Well, Julie, before you say anything, I have been growing this beard since I gave a keynote in Ecuador where we were supposed to spend spring break. So this is as clean cut as I've looked in days, but I haven't shaved. So anyway, sorry, Julie, keep going.
So I apologize for ghosting you guys, but I think, I obviously joined the webinar today because I know your work and am interested in your thinking around standards work. But today I joined it just thinking about how could this inform the work we're doing in online learning and supporting teachers in online learning. And I guess one of the connects I see to this is that in online learning, it's very difficult to know what students really, quote, understand related to the work that they're doing, because it's so easy to, have your phone next to you and cheat on a multiple choice test if you're inclined. And I think one of the things that this draws to me is, makes me think about is, how can we design assessments so that we're getting at that notion of the connection between concepts, knowledge, and process in the work that we're doing? And if you just look at those quotes that he used are, rich with concepts, and the evidence that the kids create are also rich with content. So you can see the kids making connections between the content and the concepts that they are, that they're working to understand. So one of my questions is, do you know of a place where we could get more examples of these types of assessments to share with people, given dealing with COVID-19? And then my other question is, I would love, I've read a lot of your work on grading, and I would love to know, even though it's not the focus of this conversation, I'd love to hear your thinking about grading, and when we think about grading in the fourth quarter.
As in what we might do about grading in the fourth quarter, given the COVID experience
Yes.
right now, Julie?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do have some thoughts on that.
I'm sure.
How about I take one question at a time? And this, Julie did not set me up for this question, but if you're going to ask where you can find some more of these things, I have been working with teachers in my own district on trying to design learning opportunities and structures that we could use, that teachers could supply with the students and guide and help, but a lot of that learning and investigation and thinking can occur in environments where the teacher is not there. You with me, Julie? Obviously that's, yeah. So my website actually, you have no idea how reluctant I am to often say that, because I never like to use these sessions as a forum for, hey, buy my book or visit my website, whatever. But having said that, let me just, okay, couple things. There's also a grade 3 version of Walkabout for the elementary people tuning in. I'll be real quick, Julie, because this is just, it's hard for me to get out of this presentation then back in. So just give me a second. We did a poster project with our grade 3s, and Greg, I'm going to try to make sure that I sent you this. If I didn't, I will, and hopefully you can just embed it in those things. Grade 3 students went around the school taking pictures that reflected their views of kindness, cooperation in their school, and so on. So you might see middle of your screen, Emily came up with, everyone is different in their own ways. That's a nice thing about about Parkway or Queens Park Elementary. Now their task was to go take a picture somewhere on the school grounds that reflects their theme. And I worked on this with a fantastic educator called Scott, by the name of Scott McIntosh. And anyway, this was a fantastic activity. And we also, he built a rubric, but what I wanted to show you was that we had the grade 3 students interact with it by taking their statement and their idea of their photo, putting it on a sticky, and then going up literally and talking with their classmates about where they believe it belonged on the assessment. So for all teachers out there, but particularly elementary, this worked really, really well to get students to engage with the assessment tool. And I want to point out here, we left a space on that very first row for students to put those stickies, and it was just our attempt to get them talking more about it. So, Julie, I have more of these tools, and here's an example. This looks pretty busy, but I want to show you what we're doing. I had a electives teacher say, well, I teach auto. How am I supposed to reach out to students during this COVID crisis? The shop is our forum. So what I've been helping with is quiet. Sorry, I hit snooze rather than stop on my alarm. What a rookie. Okay. First and foremost, there's some content pieces here and some competencies. What we've designed was, his students can watch a short intro video that's actually kind of funny on the combustion engine. Then there's a YouTube video where oil viscosity and numbers are explained. And then there's an issue around Subaru. I chose Subaru because we had a relatively new Subaru that needed a brand new engine, which seems so weird to me. And then turns out that Subaru is experiencing some pretty high oil consumption. Although maybe I get in trouble here, Greg, for talking about a company online. I don't know, but we'll see. I'm in Canada. They probably can't sue me. Anyway, here, Julie, is the assignment and the actionable verbs for students, and then a bit of a assessment rubric down below for students to either self-assess or the teacher to assess it. So, and I know that we're so short on time, Julie. These things are, I'm going to load more and more of these up on my website. This one here is a inquiry assignment asking students in a social justice class to explore where's the line between suspending basic civil liberties and protecting society. Here's some articles to read, and you'll need to make some arguments and some discussion around that. So I'm going to be emailing Greg more of these documents. You can find some of these things on myrondueck.com. And at the very, very top, you're going to see a menu item that reads, I think, COVID support documents. So today I'm going to upload even more of these because, Julie, I'm hoping that this will be helpful. Sorry, I didn't get to your other question. How are we going to grade? Where I see, I'll be really quick, Greg, where I see some of this landing is, what if we took a snapshot, generally speaking, of where our students were prior to, say, spring break or March, whatever, when you last saw them. And then you were to use descriptors to talk about the extent to which they engaged in learning opportunities that were afforded to them. Things like the documents I just showed. I think a descriptor and getting some of these documents back that are unique. They can't just copy a multiple choice question off each other with some of the type of assignments I just showed. One student's argument about suspending, the balance between suspending civil liberties and societal protection is going to be different than the next. I think unique assignments, fewer categories than percentages for us assessing them, even potentially pass-fail, which has been lots of articles out there, really good ones on do we tackle a pass-fail system. Feel free to email me. You have my email there, and I can send you links to some of those articles. So I think a snapshot before the students left, descriptors of the extent to which they participated, and then unique assignments that at least give the teacher a hope of differentiating who did what. Those are some of my thoughts. So, but Julie, we're knee deep in this also, and I don't know of anybody who's got all the answers. So I think it's about exploring and trying things. And like Greg said, no one on this screen is the expert, and I haven't been through the COVID crisis before. So I don't know if anybody else has, but if you have, let us know how it went and what you did. But for all of us, it's new. So anyway, I want to thank Greg and the folks at PNW BOCES, correct?
That's right.
And a great series you're running here. And I just hope there's been some value for people here this morning, and hang in there. We're going to see the other side of this.
Myron, I just want to say thank you. Thought-provoking. You've stretched my thinking and understanding. I just want to thank those of you that hung in here a little bit later, and those that had to take off for other meetings. Myron, your insight and expertise is highly valued by our group here. We appreciate the collaboration, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in different ways. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Greg, and take care, everybody. Be safe, be compassionate. Stay safe.
Thanks, Myron. I'm going to just ask you to end the recording. If I push the recording button there, I'm going to take the hosting back in a second.
I knew there was a way here to do it. I'm going to go stop share. I think that was the way.
Yep, and at the bottom of the screen, you're going to